The small town of Birchwood was eerily quiet that evening. The air was crisp, the sky painted with streaks of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. But tonight, something was brewing, a storm that would shake the community to its core. Lila Johnson hobbled along the cracked sidewalk, her crutches clicking against the pavement. Her leg, wrapped in a thick white bandage, ached with every movement. She had been in a car accident a month ago, one that had left her with a fractured leg and an enduring sense of vulnerability. But tonight, she was determined to get home after a long day at her part-time job at the library. The streets were mostly deserted, save for the occasional car rolling by or a distant dog barking. Lila kept her head up, her dark brown eyes scanning the area as she moved. She was only a few blocks from her apartment when she heard the faint hum of a police cruiser approaching. The vehicle slowed as it neared her, the headlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Her heart skipped a beat. Encounters with the police had always made her uneasy, especially in this town. Stories about Officer Darren Blake, a cop infamous for his aggressive behavior, had circulated for years. He had a reputation for targeting black residents, and though many had filed complaints, nothing ever seemed to come of it. As the cruiser pulled up beside her, the window rolled down, revealing Officer Blake's face. His sharp features were illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights, and his expression was cold and unreadable. "Out late, aren't we?" Blake said, his voice low and edged with menace. Lila tightened her grip on her crutches, her pulse quickening. "Just heading home," she replied, keeping her tone steady. She didn't want to give him any reason to escalate the situation. Blake smirked, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down. "On crutches, huh? What happened? Steal something and tripped while running away?" Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I was in an accident. Just trying to get home." Blake chuckled, the sound sharp and mocking. "Sure you are." He opened the car door and stepped out, the soles of his boots crunching against the gravel. Lila instinctively took a step back, her crutches wobbling beneath her. "Look, I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice firm but laced with anxiety. Blake's smirk widened. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? Just doing my job, making sure everything's safe." The street was deserted, no witnesses in sight. Lila felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't run, couldn't defend herself if things went sideways. Her only hope was to keep him talking and pray that someone would come by. Blake circled her slowly, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "You know," he said, almost casually, "I've seen your type before. Always walking around like the rules don't apply to you. Thinking you're above the law." Lila's hands trembled as she gripped her crutches. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake stopped in front of her, his expression darkening. "Wrong? That's for me to decide." And with that, he lashed out with his boot, striking her crutches and sending her sprawling to the ground. Lila cried out as she hit the pavement, the impact jolting her injured leg. Pain shot through her body, leaving her gasping for breath. Blake stood over her, his shadow looming like a predator over its prey. "Get up," he barked, his tone icy. Tears stung Lila's eyes as she struggled to push herself upright, but her injured leg refused to cooperate. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of pain and defiance. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Blake crouched down, his face inches from hers. "Because I can," he said simply, his voice devoid of empathy. Just then, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the street. A figure emerged from the shadows, a young man in his 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He froze when he saw Lila on the ground and Blake standing over her. "Hey," the man shouted, his voice ringing out across the empty street. "What's going on here?" Blake straightened, his hand moving to his gun. "Move along," he ordered, his tone dripping with authority. The young man didn't budge. "She needs help," he said, his voice firm. "You can't just leave her like that." Blake's eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the handle of his firearm. "I said, move along." But the man didn't move. Instead, he pulled out his phone, the screen glowing as he started recording. "Nah, I'm not going anywhere. People need to see this." Blake's jaw tightened, his expression flickering with anger. He took a step towards the man, but before he could act, another voice called out from further down the street. "Is everything okay over here?" A second person appeared, a woman with a small dog on a leash. She glanced between Lila, still on the ground, and Blake, her brow furrowing in concern. Blake hesitated, clearly aware that the situation was spiraling out of his control. His gaze flicked back to Lila, then to the young man still recording. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his cruiser, slamming the door shut. As the engine roared to life and the car sped off, Lila felt a wave of relief wash over her. The young man hurried to her side, helping her sit up. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face filled with concern. Lila nodded weakly, though her body was trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman with the dog knelt beside her, offering a bottle of water. "We need to report him," she said. "What he did was wrong." Lila nodded again, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lila sat on the curb, still shaken but holding herself upright with the help of the young man who had stepped in. His name was Marcus, and as he crouched beside her, the glow of his phone still recording the aftermath, his expression was a mixture of anger and concern. The older woman with the dog, Mrs. Carmichael, stood nearby, her face tight with indignation. "That man, he's been doing this for years," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice trembling. "Officer Blake. Everyone in this neighborhood knows his name. He's a bully, a thug hiding behind a badge." Lila wiped her face with the back of her hand, her palms scraped and sore from her fall. Her leg throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the indignity she had just suffered. She looked at Marcus, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Did you get everything?" Marcus nodded, holding up his phone. "Every word, every move. He's not getting away with this." Mrs. Carmichael's little dog barked, its high-pitched yaps echoing in the quiet street. She shushed the dog gently and turned her focus back to Lila. "We can't let this slide. I've seen him intimidate others, but this is different. You're injured. We have to take action." Lila nodded, though her mind was already racing. The incident wasn't just about her, it was a symbol of the unchecked power Blake wielded over vulnerable people in their community. But she also knew the uphill battle that lay ahead. Reporting him would mean reliving the trauma, facing scrutiny, and risking retaliation. Marcus interrupted her thoughts. "I'll drive you to the hospital," he offered. "We'll get you checked out first, then we'll figure out the next steps." Mrs. Carmichael chimed in, her tone firm. "And I'll call a few neighbors. People need to hear about this. We'll stand behind you, Lila. You won't face this alone." Lila managed a small smile, grateful for their support. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but heartfelt. With Marcus's help, she stood up, leaning heavily on her crutches. Her leg screamed in protest, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. As they walked toward Marcus's car, parked a few blocks away, a squad car sped past, its lights flashing but sirens silent. Lila tensed, instinctively shrinking back. Marcus noticed and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe with me," he said, his tone steady. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the tension in the air palpable. Marcus kept glancing in the rearview mirror, as if expecting Blake's cruiser to appear at any moment. Lila stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of anger, fear, and determination. When they arrived at the emergency room, the bright fluorescent lights made Lila squint. A nurse at the reception desk glanced up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Lila's bandaged leg and scraped hands. "What happened?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. Lila hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Marcus stepped in. "She was attacked," he said simply. The nurse frowned but didn't press further. She motioned for a wheelchair, and within minutes, Lila was being examined by a doctor. Marcus stayed nearby, his phone still in hand, ready to document anything that might help their case. While Lila was being treated, Mrs. Carmichael arrived with a small group of neighbors. They filled the waiting room, their presence a quiet but powerful statement of solidarity. Among them was Mr. Daniels, a retired lawyer who had lived in Birchwood for decades. His sharp eyes and confident demeanor immediately set him apart. "I heard what happened," he said, shaking Lila's hand gently when she was wheeled back out. "You need legal support, and I'm here to offer it. I've seen too many people fall victim to Officer Blake's abuse. It's time someone stood up to him." Lila was taken aback by the growing crowd of supporters. People she barely knew were showing up for her, willing to challenge a system that had allowed Blake's behavior to continue unchecked. It was both empowering and overwhelming. Marcus spoke up, his voice firm. "We've got video evidence, eyewitnesses, and now we have legal help. He won't get away with this." But just as they began discussing their next steps, the mood shifted. Two uniformed officers entered the waiting room, their faces impassive. One of them, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, addressed the group. "We're looking for Lila Johnson," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Lila's heart sank. Marcus stepped protectively in front of her, his jaw tight. "What do you want with her?" he demanded. The officer glanced at his partner before responding. "We received a report about an altercation involving Officer Blake. We need to take a statement." Mrs. Carmichael scoffed loudly. "An altercation? You mean an attack? Your officer assaulted her." The taller officer raised a hand, his expression unreadable. "We're just here to gather information. Ms. Johnson, would you be willing to answer some questions?" Lila hesitated, her mind racing. Was this a genuine attempt to investigate Blake, or was it an effort to intimidate her into staying quiet? She looked at Marcus and Mr. Daniels, seeking their guidance. Mr. Daniels stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Lila will cooperate, but only in the presence of her legal counsel. If this is an official inquiry, it needs to be handled properly." The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Fair enough," the taller one said. "We'll wait for her lawyer to finalize the details." As they left, the room buzzed with whispered conversations. The encounter had only reinforced the group's resolve to fight back. Lila felt a mix of fear and determination bubbling inside her. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let Officer Blake's actions go unanswered. Later that night, as Marcus drove her home, they talked about the next steps. Filing a formal complaint, rallying the community, and ensuring the video footage reached the right people. But deep down, Lila knew they were up against a powerful system that often protected its own. As they pulled up outside her apartment, Marcus turned to her, his expression serious. "You're brave, Lila. Don't forget that. We've got your back." Lila nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." The night was far from over, and the battle ahead would be long and grueling. But for the first time in a while, Lila felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, Lila woke up to the steady hum of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She groaned, her body still sore from the previous night's events, and reached over to grab the device. It was Marcus. "Hey," she answered, her voice raspy from sleep. "Morning, Lila," Marcus said. "Sorry to bother you so early, but I thought you should know. The video, it's already spreading. People are sharing it online, and it's gaining traction fast." Lila sat up, her heart skipping a beat. "How fast?" "Thousands of views," Marcus replied. "And the comments? People are furious. They're calling for Blake to be held accountable. News outlets are starting to pick it up." The weight of his words settled over her. On one hand, she was relieved that people were seeing the truth. On the other, the attention brought a new level of risk. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as pain shot through her injured limb. "I'll be over in an hour," Marcus added. "We need to start planning for what's next." By the time Marcus arrived, Lila's small apartment was buzzing with activity. Mrs. Carmichael had brought coffee and pastries, and a few other neighbors had shown up, offering their support. Mr. Daniels was seated at the dining table, reviewing notes and legal documents. "This video is a double-edged sword," Mr. Daniels said as Marcus entered. "While it's good that it's out there, it also puts a target on Lila's back. We need to move carefully." Marcus placed his phone on the table, pulling up the video for everyone to see. The footage was raw but clear. It showed Blake towering over Lila, the cruelty in his actions unmistakable. The audio captured every word, every moment of tension, until Marcus had intervened. The room fell silent as they watched, the weight of the scene settling over them like a heavy blanket. "This is powerful," Mr. Daniels said, breaking the silence. "But we need more than just public outrage. We need to build a solid case. That means gathering every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and ensuring the community stands behind Lila." Mrs. Carmichael nodded. "I've already started spreading the word. There's going to be a town hall meeting tonight at the community center. People want to talk about this." Lila's stomach churned. The idea of facing a crowd, reliving the trauma, was overwhelming. But she knew it was necessary. "I'll be there," she said quietly. That evening, the community center was packed. People filled the rows of folding chairs, their murmurs creating a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room, a small stage had been set up, with a microphone and a table for the speakers. Lila sat with Marcus, Mrs. Carmichael, and Mr. Daniels, her hands gripping her crutches tightly. The pain in her leg was a constant reminder of what had happened, but it also fueled her resolve. She scanned the room, recognizing faces from the neighborhood and beyond. It was clear that the video had struck a nerve. When Mr. Daniels stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. His voice was steady, commanding attention. "We're here tonight because of an incident that should never have happened," he began. "An abuse of power by someone sworn to protect and serve. But this isn't just about one officer. It's about a pattern of behavior, a system that allows it to continue unchecked." The crowd murmured in agreement. Lila's heart pounded as Mr. Daniels gestured for her to join him. She rose slowly, leaning on her crutches, and approached the microphone. Her voice shook as she began to speak. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces before her. "I was just trying to get home. But what happened to me is something that's happened to others, too many times. And it needs to stop." Applause erupted, a wave of support that gave her strength. As she shared her story, the fear and anger inside her transformed into determination. By the time she finished, the room was on its feet, cheering and clapping. But not everyone was supportive. In the back of the room, a group of uniformed officers stood silently, their presence a stark reminder of the battle ahead. Among them was Blake, his face a mask of barely concealed contempt. His piercing gaze locked onto Lila, sending a chill down her spine. After the meeting, Marcus walked Lila to his car. The night air was cool, the sky dotted with stars. "You were incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Thank you," Lila replied, though her mind was still on Blake's presence. "But he was there. Did you see him?" Marcus nodded grimly. "I saw him. He's not going to back down without a fight." As they drove away, Lila's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake." Her breath caught in her throat, and she showed the message to Marcus. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "We need to report this. It's probably him." Lila nodded, but fear was beginning to creep in. She didn't know how far Blake would go to protect himself, but the message made one thing clear: the stakes were higher than ever. Welcome to a story hub dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here, we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Lila's phone had been blowing up with messages from the press, activists, and even concerned strangers offering their support. But amidst the flood of attention, there was also an undercurrent of danger. The text message she had received from the unknown number hung in the back of her mind, a chilling reminder that they were up against something far bigger than just a single rogue cop. Marcus, always by her side, was focused on keeping her grounded. "We need to stay ahead of this," he said one morning as they sat at a small coffee shop, going over the strategy for the upcoming week. "We've got the community behind us, but Blake's got connections. We can't let him intimidate us." Lila sipped her coffee, staring out the window at the street bustling with morning commuters. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over everything. "I know," she replied softly. "But every time I think we're making progress, I feel like something's about to go wrong." Marcus leaned in, his eyes intense. "We'll be ready for whatever comes. And we've got people who are willing to fight with us." Lila smiled weakly. "I hope so." But as the days wore on, that hope began to fade. The more attention the case received, the more Blake seemed to push back, and his tactics were growing more aggressive. Late one night, Lila was at home watching the news when a segment caught her attention. It was a report about Officer Blake's history of complaints, dozens of incidents filed against him, many involving excessive force. The stories were shocking, but what stood out most was the fact that none of the complaints had led to any consequences. Blake's career had only thrived, his behavior shielded by the system he was part of. A sense of dread settled in Lila's stomach. This was bigger than just a personal vendetta. It was a pattern, a network of protection that had allowed Blake to act with impunity for years. The realization hit her hard. Blake wasn't just an individual cop, it was a larger system of corruption, a system that would do whatever it took to protect its own. Marcus was already on the phone with Mr. Daniels when she joined him in the living room. "We need to escalate this," he said, pacing back and forth. "If Blake's been doing this for years, there's no telling how far he's willing to go to protect his reputation." Lila took a deep breath. "What's the plan?" "We need to go public," Mr. Daniels said, his voice coming through the speakerphone. "We'll hold a press conference. It's time to get the state authorities involved. Blake's not just a local problem anymore. This is a pattern of abuse." Lila's heart raced. Going public meant risking everything. But she knew it was the right choice. She had to stand up for herself, and for the countless others who had suffered in silence. The press conference was set for the following week. As the day drew closer, tension began to mount. Lila could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense that things were about to spiral out of control. And then, late one evening, her worst fears were realized. Lila had just finished dinner when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a man she didn't recognize standing on her doorstep. His face was obscured by a cap, but there was something about the way he stood that made Lila's instincts flare. "Are you Lila Johnson?" he asked, his voice rough but quiet. "Yes," she replied, wariness creeping into her tone. "Who are you?" "I'm just here to make sure you understand the consequences of your actions," he said, his words clipped and menacing. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and you're not going to get out unscathed." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Lila stood frozen for a moment, the unease in her chest swelling to panic. She didn't recognize the man, but his message was clear: the forces they were up against weren't just local. They had their claws in deeper. Marcus arrived moments later, his face grim. "I just spoke with Mrs. Carmichael. She said she saw someone hanging around your building a few hours ago. She didn't get a good look, but she thought it was one of Blake's associates." Lila's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "We keep going," Marcus replied, determination in his eyes. "We can't back down. We have to expose him, and we have to do it soon. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Lila and her team gathered everything they could: witness statements, new video footage, and testimonies from others who had been victims of Blake's abuse. The pressure was mounting, and each day felt like a ticking clock. The press conference loomed ahead, and with it, the certainty that the truth would come to light, no matter the cost. When the day of the press conference arrived, Lila stood before a crowd of reporters, her crutches steady beneath her. The air was thick with tension, the cameras flashing like an onslaught of light. She felt like every eye was on her, the weight of the moment pressing down. Mr. Daniels spoke first, outlining the legal steps they were taking to ensure accountability for Officer Blake. Then, it was Lila's turn. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces before her. "Today, I'm here not just for myself," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion, "but for everyone who has ever been wronged, overlooked, or silenced. Officer Blake may think he's untouchable, but I'm here to show him that no one is above the law. Not anymore." The room erupted in applause, and Lila felt a surge of empowerment. But as the cheers died down, a chill ran through her. From the back of the room, she saw a familiar figure, standing in the shadows. It was Officer Blake. Lila's breath caught as her eyes locked with Blake's, the tension in the room palpable. His cold stare pierced through the crowd, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. She could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface of his composed exterior, but there was also something darker, a calculation that sent a shiver down her spine. Marcus noticed the shift in her demeanor, and without a word, he subtly positioned himself between Lila and the back of the room, his body tense. He knew that Blake wasn't just here for the press conference, he was here to send a message. Lila forced herself to look away, but her mind raced with thoughts of what this meant. Blake had been in the room, silently watching, as she had shared her story with the world. He'd heard her words, seen her resolve, and that made him dangerous. After the press conference, Lila, Marcus, and the rest of their team retreated to a secure location, a nondescript office building where they could strategize in private. The energy in the room was a mixture of excitement and nervous tension. The press conference had been a success, but the road ahead was still fraught with danger. "We need to get ahead of this," Marcus said, pacing back and forth. "Blake's already trying to intimidate us. We can't let him think he's got the upper hand." Lila nodded, though the weight of her injuries made it difficult to focus. The bandages around her leg itched, and the crutches under her arms felt like a constant reminder of what she had endured. She hated the feeling of vulnerability, but she knew she couldn't back down. "We need a plan," Mr. Daniels chimed in, his voice firm. "This isn't just about fighting Blake anymore. This is about taking down the whole system that's allowed him to act with impunity. We've got to expose everything." As they discussed their next steps, Lila's phone buzzed again. It was another message from the unknown number. Asterisk, you've made a mistake. You have no idea what you're up against. Asterisk. Her stomach turned, and she showed the message to Marcus. His face hardened as he read it. It's him, Marcus said. We need to take this seriously. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. The pressure from the public was mounting, and the authorities couldn't ignore the growing demand for accountability. But for every victory, there were setbacks. Blake's supporters were vocal, spreading false information and trying to discredit Lila. They had even gone so far as to suggest that she had fabricated the entire incident. It wasn't just the media campaign that worried Lila, it was the fear of retaliation. Late one evening, as she was leaving a meeting with her legal team, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. A black SUV was parked across the street from the building, its engine running. The tinted windows gave no indication of who was inside, but Lila knew she was being watched. She quickly got into Marcus's car, her crutches clicking against the pavement, and they drove off without looking back. But the sense of being hunted lingered, gnawing at her. They spent the next few days in a safe house, a location that was known only to a few trusted individuals. The phone calls and messages kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. But it wasn't until the third night that things escalated. Lila and Marcus were sitting in the small living room, going over the latest developments, when there was a loud bang at the door. Marcus jumped up, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept concealed. He motioned for Lila to stay back as he approached the door cautiously. Another knock. Louder this time. Stay down, Marcus whispered. Lila's heart raced as she crouched behind the couch, her hands gripping her crutches tightly. She heard Marcus's voice, low and controlled as he spoke through the door. Who's there? A cold, familiar voice answered. Let's talk, Marcus. Blake. The tension in the air was thick with danger, but Marcus didn't flinch. Go inside, Lila, he said quietly. Lock the door behind you. Lila obeyed, her mind racing. She had no intention of letting Blake intimidate her, but the reality of the situation was undeniable. The man who had hurt her was right outside. Marcus moved toward the door, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, in an instant, the door was kicked open. Blake stood in the doorway, flanked by two other men. His eyes locked onto Lila, and the hatred in them was unmistakable. You think you can ruin me? Blake sneered. You're just a pawn in a game you don't understand. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Lila and Blake. This isn't a game, Blake, he said, his voice low but firm. This is real. And it's time for you to face the consequences. Without warning, Blake lunged toward Marcus, but Marcus was faster. In the blink of an eye, he had drawn his gun and aimed it squarely at Blake's chest. The room froze. You need to leave, Marcus said, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet threat. Blake's eyes flickered toward the gun, but there was no fear in his gaze. Instead, he smiled, a dark, dangerous smile that sent a chill down Lila's spine. I'll be back, he said, his voice dripping with malice. And when I do, it won't be so easy for you. With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, his two associates following close behind. Lila's body shook as she slowly got to her feet, her crutches clicking against the floor. What now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't respond right away. He was still staring at the door, his gun still drawn. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Now, we make sure that he can't touch us again. The night following Blake's visit was uneasy. Lila couldn't shake the feeling of danger that lingered in the air. The close call had only confirmed what she had feared all along. They were no longer just fighting Blake. They were up against a system, a network that would do anything to protect its own. Marcus had insisted they stay in the safe house for the time being, but Lila couldn't just sit idly by. The longer they hid, the more power they handed to Blake and his allies. She knew she had to act, and fast. The next morning, Lila gathered her courage and met with Mr. Daniels, who had been following the case from a distance. The legal team had been pushing for the case to move forward, but there were always delays, tactical delays that felt deliberate. It was clear that the system wasn't about to let Blake fall easily. They needed to expose him, and they needed to do it in a way that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore. "We've been gathering evidence," Mr. Daniels said, flipping through a folder of documents. "But it's not enough. We need to dig deeper. We need a way to expose the corruption from the inside." Lila frowned. "You think there's more to this than just Blake?" Mr. Daniels nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Blake didn't act alone. There's a network of people protecting him, other cops, possibly higher-ups in the department. We need to find someone who can speak out from within the system." Lila felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The idea of betraying the very institution that was supposed to protect them was terrifying, but she knew it was the only way forward. That afternoon, Lila and Marcus met with a former officer, someone who had left the force years ago but who had remained in contact with a few trusted individuals within law enforcement. His name was James, and he had been a detective before he'd been ousted for speaking up about the very corruption Lila and her team were now uncovering. James sat across from them at a small, dimly lit cafe, his eyes darting around nervously. He was a man in his late 40s, weathered by years of witnessing things most people couldn't even begin to imagine. But even now, the tension in his posture was clear. "You've got to understand," James said in a hushed voice, leaning in. "Blake's not the only problem. The corruption runs deeper than you think. He's part of a bigger network, a syndicate that uses the police to shield their operations." Marcus's jaw tightened. "How far does it go? And why are you willing to help us?" James took a long breath before answering. "I've seen enough. I used to be one of them, but I couldn't keep quiet anymore. What Blake's doing isn't just about control, it's about power. And people who have power like that don't let go easily." Lila leaned forward. "How do we expose this?" James glanced around one more time before speaking in a low voice. "I can get you access to the department's internal records. It'll take some time to pull everything together, but I can help you expose the connections between Blake and the people who've been covering for him. But you need to be careful. Blake and his people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to stop you." A chill ran down Lila's spine, but she nodded, determined. "We're ready." The next few weeks were a blur of frantic activity. James worked in the shadows, hacking into the police department's internal systems and gathering files that were meant to remain buried. He sent Lila and Marcus encrypted files filled with documents, emails, and even photos that pointed to Blake's involvement in several high-profile incidents of corruption. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. One evening, as Lila sat at her desk, going over the files, she received a call from James. His voice was low and strained. "They're on to us," he said, urgency lacing his words. "Blake's got people watching me. You need to get out of there. Now." Lila's heart raced as she grabbed her crutches. "What's happening? Are you okay?" "I don't know how much time I have," James replied, his voice cutting through the line. "I've sent everything I could. You've got what you need. Just make sure it gets into the right hands." Lila could hear the tension in his voice, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the danger they were in. But there was no turning back now. "We're on our way," Marcus said, already pulling on his jacket. "Stay safe, James. We'll make sure this doesn't go to waste." Just as Marcus hung up, Lila heard a loud crash from the other side of the building. Panic surged through her. "They're here," she whispered. "We need to move." Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back exit. But before they could reach the door, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as they ducked into a small storage room, hoping to stay hidden. Through the door's narrow crack, Lila saw men in tactical gear moving quickly through the hallway. It was clear they were searching for something, or someone. She held her breath, her pulse racing, as they passed by. But just as she thought they were safe, the door to the storage room crashed open. Blake stood there, a wicked grin on his face, flanked by several armed men. "You really thought you could win?" Blake's voice was low, almost amused. "I warned you, Lila. You don't know what you're up against." Marcus stepped in front of Lila, his hand gripping the gun hidden beneath his jacket. "Get back, Blake. We've got what we need. There's no going back for you." Blake's smile faded. "We'll see about that." And then the room erupted into chaos. The gunshots rang out, deafening in the small storage room. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she ducked behind a pile of crates, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls making her ears ring. She could hear Marcus shouting, trying to protect her, but the chaos was overwhelming. Blake's voice echoed in the chaos, his command to his men cutting through the air. "Don't let them get away. Finish this." Lila's breath came in short gasps, her crutches thrown aside as she instinctively pressed herself deeper into the corner. She felt the fear clawing at her, the terrifying realization that this could be the end. But she pushed it aside. There was too much at stake. The files James had sent, everything they had worked for, was still in play. From her vantage point, she could see Marcus, his gun raised, trying to hold off Blake's men. Every shot he fired was precise, but the odds were against him. Lila could feel the sweat pooling at the back of her neck as she clutched the encrypted hard drive in her hand. It was their lifeline, the only evidence they had left to take Blake and his network down for good. A sharp cry echoed in the room, followed by a thud. Lila's heart stopped as she saw Marcus go down. He had taken a bullet to the shoulder, but he was still moving, pushing himself back up with grim determination. "Marcus!" Lila shouted, her voice cracking, but he didn't look up. He was focused on the task at hand, trying to clear a path for her. Through the chaos, she saw Blake's face, smug and victorious, standing a few feet away, watching with a chilling calm. He hadn't even flinched when the bullets had flown. To him, this was just a game. But not to Lila. Not anymore. "Get out of my way, Lila," Blake growled, stepping forward. "You've lost. Everything you've worked for ends tonight." Lila didn't back down. She didn't flinch. With her body trembling, she slowly rose from her hiding spot, the hard drive still clutched tightly in her hand. She knew this was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally fall into place. She tossed the hard drive to Marcus, who caught it with his good arm. His eyes flicked toward her, and for the briefest moment, Lila saw the same fire in his eyes that had kept them fighting all this time. It was the same fire that had kept them pushing through every setback, every attack, every threat. They weren't done yet. Blake's face twisted with rage as he watched them, realizing what had just happened. "You think this will stop me?" he shouted. "You think a few files can bring down everything I've built?" Marcus gritted his teeth, staggering to his feet despite the wound. "No, Blake," he said, his voice low but steady. "But it will start the end." Lila knew the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time, but she couldn't let it end like this, not after everything. "Marcus," she cried again, but this time she wasn't just warning him. She wasn't just scared. She was determined. She grabbed the nearest object, a metal pipe, and with all her strength, swung it toward Blake's head. The impact was jarring, but it wasn't enough to knock him out. Instead, it left Blake staggered, his hand raising instinctively to his face, but it bought them just enough time. With a growl, Blake recovered, but it was too late. Marcus was already ahead of him, firing another round, forcing Blake to retreat. The men around him hesitated, unsure of what to do, but Blake was more determined than ever. "You think you can stop me? You're just a woman with a broken leg and a pipe," Blake smeared, brushing blood from his lip. "Do you really think you have a chance?" Lila didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was done talking. Without another word, she turned to Marcus. Their eyes met for a brief moment. An unspoken understanding passed between them. They had come too far to back down now. Together, they moved as one, their instincts synchronized. They fought not just for their own survival but for the justice they had been denied for far too long. Blake's men advanced again, but this time they were less sure of themselves. The power that Blake had once commanded was slipping. They could see it in his eyes. He was losing control. And when he shouted to his men to fall back, the confusion in his voice only made things clearer. Lila and Marcus were winning. Blake turned to retreat, but as he did, Marcus fired one final shot. It wasn't meant to kill, just to incapacitate. The bullet hit Blake in the leg, and he fell to the ground with a grunt, his body shaking as he tried to push himself back up. But it was no use. He was done. Lila stood over him, the hard drive still clutched in her hand. "This is where it ends," she said, her voice steady, but there was a fire in her eyes, one that Blake would never understand. Blake glared up at her, but he was too weak to do anything. The fight had been taken from him, and the realization that his empire was crumbling hit him like a ton of bricks. Lila turned toward Marcus, her crutches supporting her shaky legs. They had done it. They had finally taken down Blake, and with him, the network of corruption that had fueled his rise to power. But they both knew this wasn't over. There would be more battles to fight, more people to hold accountable. They couldn't stop now. Lila looked down at the hard drive in her hand, the key to it all. She had the evidence they needed to expose the truth to the world. It was time to take Blake down, not just in the shadows, but in broad daylight. And for the first time since the brutal night that had changed everything, Lila felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. There was still much to be done, but now, she knew they had the power to bring about real change. The fight was far from over, but this time, they were ready.